going to go to war. They said they were not going to go to war. They said they were just going to get inspectors in. The world, in fact, voted to send inspectors in, and they still went to war. From that point on, I was in the position of making the case that it was a big, big mistake. And from that point on, I moved to bring those troops home.
Senator Klobuchar, you've publicly questioned Mayor Buttigieg's experience when it comes to being commander-in-chief. Why is your time as a U.S. Senator more valuable than his time as a U.S. Naval Intelligence Officer in Afghanistan and as mayor?
Thank you, Wolf. And I've been very clear that I respect the mayor's experience very much in the military. I just have different experience. I've been in the U.S. Senate for over 12 years. And I think what you want in a president is someone who has dealt with these life and death issues and who has made decisions. I will look at my position on the Iraq War first. I wasn't in the Senate for that vote, but I opposed the Senate for that vote, but I opposed that war. Campaigned for Senate, I ran against a Republican who ran ads against me on it, but I stood my ground. When I got to the Senate, I pushed to bring our troops home. Then I have dealt with every issue from Afghanistan to keeping our troops with good health care after what we saw with Walter Reed and being part of an effort to improve the situation for our troops in a very big way with their education and with their jobs and also with their health care. I think right now what we should be talking about, though, Wolf, is what is happening right now with Donald Trump. Donald Trump is taking us pell-mell toward another war. We have a very important resolution. We just found out today that 4 Republicans are joining Democrats to go to him and say you must have an authorization of military force if you're going to go to war with Iran. That is so important because we have a situation where he got us out of the Iranian nuclear agreement, something I worked on for a significant period of time. As president, I will get us back into that agreement. I will take an oath to protect and defend our Constitution,
Thank you.
And I will mean it.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. We're going to continue talking about who's best prepared to be Commander-in-Chief, Mayor Buttigieg.
Well, I bring a different perspective. There are enlisted people that I served with barely old enough to remember those votes on the authorization after 9/11, on the war in Iraq. And there are people now old enough to enlist who were not alive for some of those debates. The next president is going to be confronted with national security challenges different in scope and in kind from anything we've seen before. Not just from anything we've seen before. Not just conventional military challenges, not just security challenges, climate, cybersecurity challenges, climate security challenges. It's going to take a view to the future as well as the readiness to learn from the lessons of the past. And for me, those lessons of the past are personal.
Senator Warren, in our new CNN Des Moines Register poll, almost a third of your supporters say your ability to lead the military is more of a weakness than a strength of yours. Why are you best prepared to be Commander-in-Chief?
I believe the principal job of the Commander-in-Chief is to keep America safe. And I think that's about judgment. I think it starts with knowing our military. I sit on the Senate Armed Services Committee. I work with our generals, with our military leaders, with our intelligence, but I also visit our troops. I visit our troops around the world. I've been to Afghanistan, to Iraq, to Jordan, to South Korea. I've been to lots of places to talk with our troops. And I fight for our troops to make sure that they get their pay, that they get the housing and medical benefits that they've been promised, that they don't get cheated by giant financial institutions. You know, I have 3 brothers who are in the military, and I know how much our military families sacrifice. But I also know that we have to think about our defense in very different ways. We have to think about cyber. We have to think about climate. We also have to think about how we spend money. We have a problem with a revolving door in Washington between the defense industry and the Department of Defense and the Pentagon. That is corruption, pure and simple. We need to block that revolving door, and we need to cut our defense budget. We need to depend on all of our tools, diplomatic, economic, working with our allies, and not let the defense industry call the shots.
Mr. Steyer, you worked in finance for decades and have never held elected office. Why should voters believe you have the experience or judgment to serve as Commander-in-Chief?
I worked internationally around the world for decades. I traveled, I met with governments, I met with businesses, and I understand how America interacts with other countries. And you asked, what is the reason that the experience really counts? And to me, I believe that Senator Warren made a great point. It isn't so much about experience, it's about judgment. If you've been listening to this, what we are hearing is 20 years of mistakes by the American government in the Middle East, of failure, of mistakes. So the real question is judgment. And if you look who had the judgment, it was a state senator from Illinois with no experience named Barack Obama who opposed the war. It is a congresswoman, Barbara Lee, from Oakland, California, who stood up against the original vote, who is the only person in Congress. So I would say to you this, an outside perspective, looking at this and actually dealing with the problems as they are, is what we're looking for now. I agree with Senator Warren. We are spending dramatically too much money on defense. The money that we're spending there, we could spend in the other parts of the budget, and it's time for someone from the outside to have a strategic view about what we're trying to do and how to do it.
Senator Sanders, in the wake of the Iran crisis, Iran's Ayatollah Khamenei has again called for all U.S. troops to be pulled out of the Middle East, something you've called for as well. Yet when American troops last left Iraq, ISIS emerged and spread terror across the Middle East and indeed around the world. How would you prevent that from happening again?
Okay, let me tell you, but before I tell you that, let me tell you something else. And that is, and I don't know if my colleagues here will agree with me or not, maybe they will. But what we have to face as a nation is that the two great foreign policy disasters of our lifetimes were the war in Vietnam and the war in Iraq. Both of those wars were based on lies. And right now, what I fear very much is we have a president who is lying again and could drag us into a war that is even worse than the war in Iraq. To answer your question, what we need to do is have an international coalition. We cannot keep acting unilaterally. As you know, the nuclear deal with Iran was worked on with a number of our allies. We have got to undo what Trump did, bring that coalition together, and make sure that Iran never gets a nuclear weapon.
Vice President Biden.
I was part of that deal to get the nuclear agreement with Iran, bringing together the rest of the world, including some of the folks who aren't friendly to us, and it was working. It was working. It was being held tightly. There was no movement on the part of the Iranian government to get closer to a nuclear weapon. And look what's happened. He went ahead, and it was predictable from the day he pulled out of that agreement, Trump, what exactly would happen. We're now isolated. We're in a situation where our allies in Europe are making a comparison between the United States and Iran, saying both ought to stand down, making a moral equivalence. We have lost our standing in the region. We have lost the support of our allies. The next president has to be able to pull those folks back together, reestablish our alliances, and insist that Iran go back into the agreement, which I believe with the pressure applied as we put on before, we can get done.
So just to be clear, Vice President Biden, would you leave troops in the Middle East or would you pull them out?
I would leave troops in the Middle East in terms of patrolling the Gulf, where we are now, small numbers of troops. And I think it's a mistake to pull out the small number of troops that are there now to deal with ISIS. What's happened is now that he's gone ahead, the president, and started this whole process moving, what's happening? ISIS is going to reconstitute itself. We're in a position where we have to pull our forces out. Americans have to leave the entire region. And quite frankly, I think he's flat out lied about saying the reason he went after, the reason he made the strike was because our embassies were about to be bombed.
Senator Klobuchar, what's your response?
I would leave some troops there, but not in the level that Donald Trump is taking us right now. Afghanistan, I have long wanted to bring our troops home. I would do that. Some would remain for counterterrorism and training. In Syria, I would not have removed the 150 troops from the border with Turkey. I think that was a mistake. I think it made our allies and many others much more vulnerable to ISIS. And then when it comes to Iraq, right now, I would leave our troops there, despite the mess that has been created by Donald Trump. At the briefing we had last week, I was the only person on this stage that asked a question of both the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State. And I asked them about imminent threat, but I also asked them what their alternatives were. And they gave very vague answers. I asked them, where is the surge of diplomacy that we would be seeing if I was president? And I asked them where they were going to leave the Iraqi people. Time and time again, you see that this president puts his own interests, his private interests in front of our country's. I would put our country's interests first as Commander-in-Chief.
Senator Warren, leave combat troops, at least some combat troops in the Middle East, or bring them home?
No, I think we need to get our combat troops out. You know, we have to stop this mindset that we can do everything with combat troops. Our military is the finest military on earth, and they will take any sacrifice we ask them to take. But we should stop asking our military to solve problems that cannot be solved militarily. Our keeping combat troops there is not helping. We need to work with our allies. We need to use our economic tools. We need to use our diplomatic tools. Now, look, I understand. There are people on this stage, when it comes to Afghanistan, for example, who talk about 5 more years, 10 more years. Shoot, Lindsey Graham talks about leaving troops there for 100 more years. No one has a solution and an end point. We need to get our combat troops out. They are not helping create more safety for the United States or the region.
Vice President Biden, is Senator Warren right?
Well, I'll tell you what, there's a difference between combat troops and leaving special forces in a position. I was part of the coalition that put together 68 countries to deal with stateless terror as well as failed states. Not us alone, 68 other countries. That's how we were able to defeat and end the caliphate for ISIS. They'll come back if we do not deal with them and we do not have someone who can bring together the rest of the world to go with us with small numbers of special forces we have to organize the effort to take them down.
Mayor Buttigieg, you served in Afghanistan. Who's right?
We can continue to remain engaged without having an endless commitment of ground troops. But what's going on right now is the president's actually sending more. The very president who said he was going to end endless war, who pretended to have been against the war in Iraq all along, though we know that's not true, now has more troops going to the Middle East. And whenever I see that happen, I think about the day we shipped out and the time that was set aside for saying goodbye to family members. I remember walking with a friend of mine, another lieutenant I trained with, as we walked away, and his 1.5-year-old boy was toddling after him, not understanding why his father wasn't turning back to scoop him up. And it took all the strength he had not to turn around and look at his boy one more time. That is happening by the thousands right now, as we see so many more troops sent into harm's way.
Walking with a friend of mine,
another that will never happen when there is an alternative as Commander-in-Chief.
Senator Sanders.
Wolf, in America today, our infrastructure is crumbling. Half of our people are living paycheck to paycheck. 87 million people have no health care or are underinsured. You got 500,000 people sleeping out on the streets tonight. The American people are sick and tired of endless wars which have cost us trillions of dollars. Our job is to rebuild the United Nations, rebuild the State Department, make sure that we have the capability of bringing the world together to resolve international conflict diplomatically and stop the endless wars that we have experienced.
We're going to get to everyone, but Vice President Biden, you criticized President Trump's decision to kill the Iranian General Soleimani without first going to Congress. Are there any circumstances, other than a direct attack on the United States, where you would take military action without congressional approval?
I ran the first time as a 29-year-old kid against the war in Vietnam on the grounds that only way to take a nation to war is with the informed consent of the American people. The informed consent of the American people. And with regard to this idea, where, including special forces, there's no way you negotiate or been able to negotiate with terrorists. You have to be able to form coalitions to be able to defeat them or contain them. If you don't, we end up being the world's policeman again. They're going to come to us. They've come to us before, they'll come to us again. So it's a fundamental difference than negotiating with other countries. It's fundamentally the requirement that we use our special forces in small numbers to coordinate with other countries to bring together coalitions.
Mr. Vice President, just to be clear, the Obama-Biden administration did not ask Congress for permission multiple times when it took military action. So would the Biden doctrine be different?
No, there was the authorization for the use of military force that was passed by the United States Congress, House and Senate, and signed by the President. That was the authority. It does not give authority to go into Iran. It gave authority to deal with these other issues.
Mayor Buttigieg.
That authorization needs to be replaced.
Exactly. We tried to.
Look, when we lost troops in Niger, there were members of Congress who admitted they didn't even know we had troops there. And it was all pursuant to an authorization that was passed to deal with al-Qaeda and 9/11. And often Congress has been all too happy to leave aside its role. Now, thanks to Democrats in Congress, that's changing.